So in this presentation, I'm going to introduce 6 different educational theories or models to you. And I hope with the models I've chosen to build a bridge between some traditional approaches and some traditional ways of thinking about how learning works to more contemporary ones that are more easily applicable with some concrete examples for your classroom. So let's get started.
So, educational theories. There is a little bit of a hierarchy in terms of theories, paradigms, and models you'll find in education as elsewhere in humanities and social sciences. We talk about theories if we have a concept that has a significant body of proof. Paradigms are concepts that don't have that body of proof, so they are basically just the idea or philosophy of how something works. While when we look at models in this particular context, I would name a model that is something that focuses more on a process or on addressing a really, really specific issue or aspect in education. And we get to that a little bit later in the presentation. So while with all the research and the discussion around student engagement and student centeredness in higher education, this may not seem as the most valid theory to look into or to know about. I think some of the basic principles in that are motivating our students. For instance, these positive or negative reinforcers. But it is also so that in behaviorism, a part of it that is a conditioning. So we need, in particular in some disciplines, we need our students to be able to perform very specific, sometimes even repetitive tasks to a certain degree before they can move on. And in these situations, you might find that behaviorist theory is actually quite helpful to understand these processes or look at these processes and see how that works and how that frames the student's experience. So in cognitive theory, which is the next theory that has a bit of a history to it, I want to introduce very quickly Piaget's research in development, in cognitive development of children, and he was actually the first one who did a massive longitudinal study about that. There are criticisms of his research because you can see in the Stages Model YouTube video, his his model is very, very linear, and we now understand that development and learning doesn't actually work as linear as he proposes. There are several criticisms on his model nowadays that focus on his actual lack of evidence or flaws in the actual experimental design. Nevertheless, it was quite a significant and influential study undertaken, and it echoes through until today. So I felt, because it also constitutes the base for more contemporary research in cognitive theory, such as social cognitive theory or cognitive behavior theory, it is important that you at least know about it, even though it is quite highly criticized at the moment. So the next theory I wanted to briefly introduce is constructivism in education. Now, mind you, there are different disciplines using the same theory, but they use slightly different viewpoints or angles on this theory. So sociologists might approach that a bit differently than psychologists might approach constructivism. Just keep this in mind. But for the purpose of our session, for the purpose of education, constructivism, or the points in constructivism that are important are that it is meaning making through the engagement with the world, objects in a wider sense. So objects can be either physical things, or it can also be behavior patterns or communication. So it is pretty much agency and knowledge of the world surrounding. And the engagement with the environment, may it be communication, people, objects, is an internalization process, and a sense-making process. So an example I show you, that really strange photo on the right hand side, you might wonder what that is. That was my constructivist engagement when I was picking up my niece from nursery, and they had that really weird green towels with string, and I couldn't quite figure out what they were for until I realized they were shoe protectors. So to prevent people picking the kids up from having to take their shoes on and off and off and on, the kindergarten teachers had bought cheap towels and sewn them together so you could wear them as shoe protectors while picking up the kids. So actually engaging with that object and trying to figure out why this might be there and what it is used for is an example, for instance, of constructivist engagement with the environment. Other examples that are more relevant to your actual subject discipline is, for instance, an engagement with the actual subject matter, reading a textbook, writing a piece of code and debugging it and trying to figure out why it doesn't work or where an issue is, build an electric circuit and see, if they got all the layout right and the resistance right and all of that. Writing a poem might be seen as a constructivist engagement in a type of communication. And the photos about patterns is basically just a bit of a joke in saying, it's seeing patterns is making sense. If you see patterns, you start to make sense of something. You see a structure. And that's why that photo is there. So, a step up from constructivism is social constructivism. And in this form of constructivism, we see that meaning making is socially mediated. So it derives from a feedback loop with our social environment, that may be our peers or our parents or our lecturers. So in social constructivism, meaning is basically not just created in interaction with reality, but actually reality is socially determined, and depending on which network you are in, this reality might actually slightly change. And I think a really strong observation about that change in reality is if you watch news about two opposing political parties speaking about the same topic, and you can see how different a reality is depending on that social determination. The article I have linked here gives you a really good overview, and it also incorporates authenticity within that framework. So I thought you might find that interesting. An example I have given you here is one of the activities I did with master students, and I've been using balloons just to make things a little bit more interesting in helping students to mediate, to negotiate with one another the meaning of academic articles in their field. And I was teaching law students, and there was quite a bit of a challenge for them to identify premises in articles, and that is something they tried to figure out, and they had a problem with, and they found it really challenging. And so I devised this activity to help them through engagement with one another, through negotiation of that reality with one another, to make that sense, to create that sense and knowledge. So if you want to, you can read the article or just have a look at it. Now, this is where things become a little bit tricky in relationship with our hierarchies of theories, paradigms, models. So, in my opinion, situated learning is a model that sits within the social constructivist framework. However, people might disagree with me. So Levin-Wenger, who developed that model, may disagree with me and propose that this is a theory they have developed in the during the analysis of of research data and reflection on it and so on. So to me, it is a model, or in our specific situation, I would see it more as a model because it has a very specific remit of saying it engages learners in meaningful and authentic experiences which enable them to become a part of community of practice. And I give you a little bit of further reading on it if you are interested in it. What it means as an example in your practice, for instance, could be that for instance, experiments in a chemistry lab or writing code could be a meaningful or authentic experience. If you do group work or role play, for instance, to solve a problem, that might be a meaningful or authentic experience. So for instance, when I did counseling training, we had to run a session and record it with one of our peers and counsel them on an issue they had in that situation. So that was a meaningful and authentic experience. But either if you see it as a theory or if you see it as a model, it still sits within that social constructivist framework. And this is one of the things I might want to point out here, is that whatever I propose in these lectures and how I frame these things and how I structure them, there will be colleagues who agree with me, there will be colleagues who disagree with me, there will be colleagues who would add things or would take them away or just slightly rejiggle them. I have demonstrated it, or I have, designed it in a way that makes the most sense to me and hopefully the most sense to you as well, engaging with these topics very likely for the first time. So last but not least, authentic learning, which also sits within that social constructivist framework, is basically one step up from situated learning. So in situated learning, we create meaningful experiences to the students, but in a as if activity. When you think about children, when they play house or they play school or they play rubber and policeman, these all are as if activities. Now in authentic learning, we engage our students in actual real life challenges. So that could be our computing science students create an app for a charity, or our social work students go and work with a local community center and run some activities or events there and then reflect on these. So these would be examples for authentic learning. So when you take these meaningful learning situations you had under situated learning that did have a real life context, but still happened in our formative learning environment. So if you take these and you put them into the actual world, into the actual reality, then that is authentic learning. And another good example for authentic learning are workplace or internships, activities the students can undertake. So this is authentic learning. And again, to me, that is a model, and it sits within the social constructivist framework, because very often it relies heavily on feedback from the environment these activities take place in.
So I hope this gave you a bit of an idea of the different models and different ways of framing your analysis of thinking about education, about learning and teaching. And if you have any questions, or if you want to have a chat about how something like this could be applicable to your own classroom or to your lectures, just send me an email or post something in the forum and we can have a chat about it.